What's up out there? A couple weeks ago, I was doing some research on RimWorld DLC and I ran across a couple of tier list videos and I liked the concept of it. So here we are with a tier list for Melvor Idol and the expansions. Now, I stole an idea, well, the concept, but I stole the idea, one idea from each of the videos that I watched. One guy included the base game into it. It kind of adds some context to it. And I thought that was a really cool idea. And the other guy, he made a rule that you can only put one expansion on one letter. So we can't double everything. It's not all S tier or anything like that. So let's do this. And if you have your own tier list, drop it down in the comments below. I'm curious what other people think of this, but let's run through these real quickly here. The base game includes, and I know the base game is required. That's not the point of it. This is merely here to put this in relation to where I think these other expansions sit to it. It is required though. I want to acknowledge that. What you get in the base game is level 1 through 99 for all of the skills. There's some skills that get added with Atlas of Discovery and Into the Abyss, but the base game is fully contained. There's a ton of skills. They all go to level 99. There's a lot of dungeons. There's a lot of items to collect. There's a lot to do if you want to do completion. There's a ton of content in the base game. Throne of the Herald. This takes the base game and takes those level 1 through 99 skills and then adds 100 through 120. So all the skills, combat and non-combat in the base game get 120, up to level 120, which means this makes the base game much easier to get through because you've got hit points at level 120 instead of 99. That means you've got extra hit points. You've got extra accuracy with your attack skill, harder hitting magic and range and stuff like that. You also get agility and astrology to level 120. So agility, you can't get all of the agility obstacles because there's certain items that are locked behind the beating of the base game. But there's a lot of stuff you can get, and I think you can even get all the way to the Pillar of Expertise or whatever. So you can get a lot of extra boosts from agility and astrology both. Astrology, you can just get all of it. You can unlock the whole thing, all 120, all masteried out, everything. So there's a lot of content that will help you beat the base game. It makes the base game a little bit easier. There's amulets and rings and stuff like that you can use. And then once you beat the base game, there's a whole expansion to go, dungeons and Slayer areas and all that kind of stuff. There is a ton of gear in there. The only downside to Throne of the Herald is, and it's not really a downside, I understand why they did it, so I don't want to say it like it's a bad thing, but the one thing you don't get access to with Throne of the Herald is any of the combat gear. So until you beat Impending Darkness in the base game, you're locked out of all the combat gear. You can't use any of the armor or wands or swords or spells or any of that stuff. That is all contained for the expansion itself. But there are a number of things, level 120 skills, agility, astrology, rings, amulets, all that stuff merges into the base game, and you can use all of that stuff to help you beat the base game. Extra Slayer area negation with astrology and agility and stuff like that. Like there's so many things you get out of Throne of the Herald that feed back into the base game and help you beat it to get into Throne of the Herald and play through that content. Atlas of Discovery. This one adds 2 skills. You get cartography and archaeology. Cartography has some nice bonuses you can use. There's some cool stuff in there. There's some additional dungeons. There's some gear and all kind of stuff that unlocks. You get barrier monsters. You get ancient relic mode, which is probably one of the best modes in the game. Unless they add something else, relic mode is like one of the premier game mode for the whole thing. The gear's okay. You can use it throughout the base game and the Throne of the Herald and stuff like that. The one problem there's 2 problems that this expansion has. Number one, it sits in a weird place. So Throne of the Herald picks up after the base game. Into the Abyss picks up after the base game. Atlas of Discovery is kind of off on its own, and you can kind of just forget about it for a long time. Which brings us to problem number 2. If you do forget about it and go into Throne of the Herald, there's, I think it's the Necromancer's Palace. You get some Necromancer gear out of it that completely trivializes Atlas of Discovery. So you can make this a very easy expansion if you just ignore it, which makes it kind of forgettable, which is unfortunate. Then we have Into the Abyss. Now, Into the Abyss is pretty much a standalone expansion, if you want to look at that, that starts after Impending Darkness. Now, there is absolutely nothing from the Into the Abyss expansion that feeds back into the base game. The only time you actually want to play Into the Abyss is once you've beaten the base game and are ready to go into it, because there's nothing, unlike Throne of the Herald, there's nothing from Into the Abyss that reaches back into the base game. There's nothing at all. And there's very little from the base game and the other two expansions that works forward. There are some things that do. It's kind of confusing, but there are some things that do and some things that don't work into the Abyss expansion. But there is all new content, and it's almost about as much content as the base game. It is very, very grindy, though. It is what I would like to call an end-game expansion. So Throne of the Herald is definitely an in-game expansion, but I think Into the Abyss is even more. Like, you really need to understand how the base game works and a lot of shortcuts and stuff. Throne of the Herald plays a lot like the base game. Into the Abyss is a very grindy version of the base game. Monsters have more hit points. Things that you want to create, like crafting or smithing or something like that, all take a lot more materials to go into it. It's a very grindy experience, and you benefit from knowledge of the game. So it's easy to recommend the base game in Throne of the Herald and Atlas of Discovery. Into the Abyss is a little bit harder to recommend, and it's only there for people that have definitely beaten the base game just because of where it sits and where it starts. In fact, one of the big complaints about Into the Abyss is people bought it without having beat the base game first. So now they've got this expansion that turned a bunch of stuff on that they couldn't get around. That's now been changed, so you've got a realm switcher, so you can actually swap between the two realms, which makes it very handy. You could disable the expansion itself, but this is one of those expansions you don't really want until you've actually beaten the base game. And you can really only idle one of these things at a time, so you can't idle the base game and Into the Abyss at the same time. You're one or the other. That's it. Oh, and you do get harvesting and corruption with Into the Abyss. They also have the skill trees and stuff like that, but the skill trees I think are a little bit deceiving. It feels more like they pulled stuff out of the game and like a free-to-play game. They pulled stuff out and then sell it back to you. They create the problem and sell it back to you, which this isn't a free-to-play game and it's not like that, but it's what it feels like. The whatever those things are, the total brain fright on that, but it feels like they pulled some of the modifiers out, and then as you level up, you get to get a little bit reduced cost and stuff like that. But they made everything cost so much more. It's a very grindy expansion. So let's dive into this whole thing. Where do I think these fit? First and foremost, the base game, I'm going to put on A tier. I think that is very fair. There are two expansions that I think are worse, and there's one expansion that I think is absolutely exceptional, which you can probably guess the way this is going to turn out. Throne of the Herald, absolute S tier. Without a doubt, the amount of content that you get, the way that this plugs into the base game, you can actually use so much of the content to get through the base game and trivialize Into the Abyss and Impending Darkness and stuff like that. It just makes everything so much easier. I think this is not necessarily a mandatory expansion, but this is a very, very highly recommended expansion. Just because of the interactions that it has, I think it's excellent. I think it's the one expansion. If you came to me and said, I own the base game, which expansion should I buy? That one right there. That's the one. Now, what do we do with these other two? Because they're a little weird. They both have their niche. And honestly, I was going to go one way with these. And then I ended up thinking about it overnight. And I was like, you know what? I think the opposite is true. I would actually put Into the Abyss at B tier. And I know that might sound odd. And we're going to, of course, put Atlas of Discovery at C tier. The problem that I have with Atlas of Discovery is the one thing that I can absolutely recommend Atlas of Discovery for is Ancient Relic mode. That is the best game mode this game has to offer. After that, Atlas of Discovery really doesn't have a lot. Cartography is really cool, and there's some bonuses for it. Cartography is really cool. All the barrier monsters and all that stuff, a lot of that's forgettable. I don't remember any of it. I think I've only gone through Atlas of Discovery like twice. I don't remember a lot of it. I certainly remember some of it, and I remember some of the things we go into. I very much remember Into the Abyss a lot more. I've been playing it a lot more recently, of course, because it's the newest expansion. But to me, Atlas of Discovery is extremely forgettable. I don't remember a lot of it. What I remember from Into the Abyss is a lot of grind. And there are some cool things in there, don't get me wrong. There's some really cool stuff in Into the Abyss. But as far as if I was to recommend expansions to people, I would definitely say Throne of the Herald is almost, I don't want to say mandatory, but it is the most recommended one that I can possibly push forward. Into the Abyss, I would not recommend this until you actually beat the base game. And once you're through the base game, this is an excellent expansion. Like I said earlier, if you get into it and you understand how all the mechanics and everything work, the grind is still a grind, but you kind of see what they were going for, and it makes you appreciate a little bit more. I like the expansion. I like the expansion a lot, but I don't think it's not in relation to the base game. I don't think it's better than the base game. I think Throne of the Herald just absolutely blows all these other ones out of the water. And then Atlas of Discovery just kind of sits in a weird place. Like, it's not after the base game, so you can go into Throne of the Herald, get the Necromancer gear, and come back and beat a bunch of it. So it's kind of a disposable one. It's kind of like the last one that I would play or buy or something like that. Relic mode, phenomenal. The rest of it, it's okay. It's not that great. And you can use some of this stuff in the Throne of the Herald for sure, like some of the gear you get out of that. But once you get deeper into the Throne of the Herald, like once you're past like level 100 or 105 or something like that, you start getting into the harder monsters and dungeons and Slayer areas and stuff like that. All the content from the base game and Atlas of Discovery basically goes away. On the combat side, once you get into the Throne of the Herald, you're pretty much in Throne of the Herald and you're using all that gear from there. So none of the gear from Atlas of Discovery really goes very far. You can use some of this in the base game and the early parts of Throne of the Herald, but that's kind of about it. A lot of stuff you get from Throne of the Herald applies to the base game, Into the Abyss, and Atlas of Discovery, because agility and astrology does carry over into the Abyss. A lot of it does. So Throne of the Herald just keeps proving itself to be the premier expansion that we've had for the entire game. And like I said, I think Into the Abyss has its place, Atlas of Discovery has its place, but for my money, this is the order that I would recommend. And you want to buy the base game first, but as far as expansions go, Throne of the Herald, beat the base game, then you could do Into the Abyss or Throne of the Herald, and then you could throw Atlas of Discovery in there anywhere you want, because like I said, it's kind of a disposable one. Atlas of Discovery probably wouldn't be bad to follow everything up with, because once you get through with these, you could go through Ancient Relic mode. You'd be very primed for Ancient Relic mode in this order if you went like that. So anyway, that is my tier list, and it kind of surprised me when I swapped Into the Abyss and Atlas of Discovery around. For some reason, it felt right. I was like, I wasn't thinking about it, but Atlas of Discovery is the weakest expansion that we've got. Aside from a couple of things, it is the weakest link. So anyway, that's going to do it for this video. We will catch you on the next one. Take care.